I'm just going to rifle through a whole bunch of tiny little tips and tricks, and maybe one of them will be useful to you. Okay. If you've got a computer in your room while you're recording or live streaming, look into software that can reduce the speed of your computer fans to minimize the noise. If you're using a laptop in conjunction with a live stream, or maybe you're doing a Kickstarter preview, whatever, switch the laptop into presentation mode. I guess this works for Windows. I'm not sure if Mac has an equivalent, so that you won't be bothered by pop-ups about updates, etc. Get into the habit of using Google Docs for notes and checklists, and Google Slides to walk you through sections in a video. So if you're doing like a review, maybe you're not going to have a script that you read, but you will want to walk through certain sections. Having those on a tablet in front of you and easily being able to advance pages either with a foot pedal or just finger on the tablet can help keep your reviews structured, etc. If you're live streaming and have a second monitor that you can devote for chat comments, I find that useful. Connect a laptop to it, go onto YouTube, pop out the chat and expand it to full size. You can Control Plus to make the font bigger, and that lets you put the comments as they're coming in very big on a nice big monitor in large font so you can see them very clearly and respond to them. If you're using OBS, you can find a script that actually puts the chat comments on screen recorded into the video, which makes it a little easier for the audience to watch later when you're responding to questions. If you're using a tablet to do something like a Kickstarter preview or whatever, do two things. Buy a device that lets you connect USB to HDMI that's powered, so your tablet doesn't use up power while it's doing that. And use the tablet screencast mode to record a full video of whatever is being shown on the tablet. Makes it a lot cleaner to edit into a final product afterwards. If you are using a top-down camera, I talked about the idea of stopping zoom creep, which is when the lens just by gravity falls down a bit and zooms in. You can use a rubber band to do that. Learn to use the audio filter settings either in your video editor or on your live stream device or software. The main ones to look for are a compressor and an expander. Those are the most important ones. You can find good videos on how to set those up depending on how you're live streaming. Take a light touch. Otherwise, and use headphones. Otherwise, you might think that you're doing yourself a favor by turning on high, by setting the noise reduction to high. It's very easy to set that and be like, oh, that's great. I don't hear any noise anymore. I don't hear the air conditioner. I don't hear the fan. It's perfect. But what you're not hearing is that it's made your voice sound weird. It's either made your voice sound like it's turning on and now all of a sudden you hear all the noise and then turning off when you're silent, or it's done weird things to your voice. Get headphones, check it out, spend time up front getting your audio right, then you won't have to mess with it again. For your front camera, use a small tripod on a countertop on a cabinet so that it's off the floor. Get everything off the floor. And find a systematic way of changing the tilt of the camera depending on the kind of video you're making, whether it's a pure talking head like this or whether you need to see the whole board. Sometimes I use blocks under the tripod leg, and I know this block is the one I use when I'm filming a close-up, and this is the block I use when I want a full view of the table. If you've got a camera that has a My Menu section, so you can put all your most frequently used settings for your camera in it, take some time, go through, put all your commonly used settings in that menu area. That way you never have to hunt around from them. Your camera may have a favorite settings dial that restores them. You might want to save different configurations in there. For me, it's things like turning off the HDMI overlay so that when I live stream, I turn that off. When I'm not live streaming, I turn it back on, stuff like that. Turn off stabilization in your camera. Nothing you're filming should involve the camera moving, whether it's attached to an arm top down or on a tripod face forward. So stabilization has some penalties to it, whether it's in resolution or image moving. You should be turning those off. You don't need that. Get yourself a dual SD card reader and install some software that lets you queue up the transfer of those files. If you're using an editor like Adobe Premiere or whatever, learn how to batch produce things like proxy files for faster editing of huge 4K files. You might even check on your camera if it has a lossless zoom, digital zoom feature that you might use for your top-down camera on certain scenes where you want a larger view. Get yourself some wide blue tape or black gaffer's tape to tape down wires or get stuff out of the way and keep your wiring neat. A couple of generic pieces of advice. Spend the time in the beginning figuring out how to automate processes that are not fun and are time consuming. Whether that's making checklists of your editing procedure, whether that's learning how to find macros that do a bunch of steps at once, like noise reduction or equalizing volume, or finding plugins for your video editor that will automatically export your video file at a size YouTube wants. Put the time in up front to eliminate as much manual, repetitive work as possible so that you're focusing on the enjoyable, fun part. Spend the money on setups that make it easier for you to tear down and reset up. Whenever you're trying new stuff with your camera, new setting, new lighting, new view, new angle, resist the temptation of doing lots of recording with this new setup because it looks right. It looks pretty good. Let's just spend the 2 hours, record it, play through it, whatever. No. Get into the habit of doing a fast turnaround from the camera to the PC where you can look at it and where you can focus on how it looks and sounds with headphones, and get that turnaround going multiple times until you get it the way you want. You document it, you checklist it, you make notes of how it is set up, then you can repeat it. Anytime you change something, do a quick test, bring it to the computer, make sure it looks right, make sure it's not tilted. There are a lot of things to go wrong. Lastly, a little tip for if you're recording stuff that requires you to do editing. Most of what I do and record is just one long take. I found that it's not worth doing lots of editing and lots of retakes just for the stuff I do. Occasionally, I'll make a video where there's certain things I want to say and multiple takes, like I'm doing this video series, I'm doing multiple takes of these different sections. When you're doing that, the most painless thing to have to edit is when you just have to cut out sections. So it's when you have to start moving around. So you do this take, then you do this over here, and then you want this to happen before this. Moving that around is painful. But if you can keep it going, like do a take of this, then retake, and then when you got that down, move to your next section. That's the first thing. But more specifically, if you leave yourself several seconds of silence between takes, and then if at the end of a take you give some large hand gesture, if you're going to redo that take, like I do this, if I don't like the take, I'm going to redo it. And if I like a take, I might do something else like this. Those two things, the silence and the hand gestures, makes it much easier to find those sections of the video when you're editing. When you're editing, you can see the waveform and you can actually see where the silence is. So if you're editing and you look at an hour of on your timeline track, you have no idea what video is happening during that hour. But if you look at the audio waveform, you can see the sections broken up by silence. That makes it much easier to skip from ahead and backward sections. And then when you're scrubbing through, when you're playing at fast speed or rewinding at fast speed, those large hand gestures can let you really quickly find the section you want to use and keep, and skip over the sections that end with something telling you you want to redo it. So there you go. Huge number of little tips, most useless, but maybe you found something there that's useful to you. One tip that I could not recommend more highly is to get in the habit of using checklists. And I say checklist, but I really mean like checklists and a note page. And I've got dozens and dozens of them for all different areas of the channel. And I use Google Docs for this. It makes it easy to share with someone else and easy to organize them and keep them online. Just to give you some idea of the kinds of checklists I use, the first one I use is not actually in front of me here. It's taped on below the camera, and I'm meant to read it every time I start recording something, other than if I was live streaming. But if I'm recording a video, I read this little script, and here's what it says. The recording light is blinking and the timer is running. The aperture is blank, ISO is blank, shutter speed is blank, and we're in focus. There are XX hours on the card. The room is quiet and the levels are good. And then if I'm live streaming, I say there's no HDMI overlaid and the live stream is recording. And if I'm using a tablet, it says the tablet is recording and screen is capturing. That is my last chance to catch mistakes, all mistakes that I have made. So you'd be surprised if you're changing things and moving around, you forget. Sometimes you talk into a camera for a half hour and you realize, oh, it wasn't even recording because I was in a rush to get started. So the first thing that little pre-record script does is it forces me to acknowledge and check certain things. Just the barest of minimum, that I'm recording, there's room on the card, that we're in focus, and that the room is quiet and the levels are good, so I can see on my screen that when I don't talk, the audio level should be at 0, and when I do talk, it's not maxing out. So these are all things, sort of sanity checks. The other thing that it does is I say out loud these settings. Aperture is, and I look at the aperture, I see it's 5.6. The ISO is 1000. The shutter speed is 180. There's 5 hours on the card. That does a little sanity check. So I read that and I say, whoa, I thought the aperture was this value and it's not. It helps me catch errors. But the other thing it does is it gets onto that recorded video what the settings were. In case I need to go and do a follow-up video, whatever, and I want the same settings. So you'll find your own script, but I would recommend a little pre-record script. It also slows you down, makes sure you stop and haven't forgotten something. So that's my recording start script. That's right there. And then on the wall here, I keep a couple of these others. I've got my filming checklist. This would be if I'm recording something to edit later. And it's just got basic stuff. It says, make sure the computer volume's down, that you're not wearing a fine-grained shirt. Turn off your phone. Make sure the AC is turned off. These are things that it's easy. You'd be surprised how easy it is to overlook all this stuff. Turn off the ceiling fan. It's very common that the ceiling fan is on when I'm not filming, so I have to make sure I turn it off. It reminds me to turn on certain lights, go to the bathroom, set a do not disturb sign, run the felt over the table, check that the view is centered. That's another thing that should probably be on the recording script. It's easy to get the camera slightly off center, etc. A couple reminders here while I'm filming to give some space at the beginning of every video where it's silent. Make sure nothing's cut off in frame, etc. Then I've got I've got a note for when I'm live streaming, some notes for myself. It tells me to print out a sheet that I paste about there that tells me the current date and time to remind me what we're doing. I've got some preps for my laptop that I use to look at comments. I remind myself to turn the laptop in presentation mode, pop out the YouTube chat, put it full screen on the monitor. A couple things to remind me of what to do with the PC software OBS that I'm recording. Check all the scenes, make sure all the scenes look good, make sure the title page is good. Make sure I turn off the HDMI information that would normally be showing on my monitor. When I'm live streaming, I have to remember to turn that off. That's a very easy one to forget. Reminder to actually record on the cameras even though I'm live streaming. Check auto levels, set timers, etc. And then a little set checklist to remind me the sequence when I start a stream. I start on the countdown timer, then I switch to the front camera and my introduction. So those two I tend to keep on the wall. Then I've got a couple others that I just keep in storage. One, which I recommend, is my list of configurations for the camera and aperture. So for example, I've got a setup when it's just a talking head and I don't need to see the table. That tells me what lens is on, what aperture settings. So I tend to have a wide open aperture if it's just me talking, and what ISO settings. So I know that everything is set up consistently. So I know when I just want me framed without the table, I know here's the ISO, here's the aperture, here's the lens, etc. I can recreate it. I don't have to mess around with it. I don't accidentally shoot too dark or too bright. Then I've got different setups. If I need most of the board to be visible on the table, then that would be a different setup. So configuration of camera settings and lenses and lighting. And I've got separate documents of notes of other settings in the camera that I don't have to mess with. And then I've got a couple checklists for certain videos. Like when I do a review, this reminds me what topics to cover in what order. And recently we've moved to using, rather than a single page for this, using Google Slides on a tablet and advancing through them. But anyway, this is just my way of encouraging you to create a bunch of checklists for the different things you do, live streams, filmings, editings, and a short read as the first thing you do for each video. If you were doing Kickstarter previews, you might have a separate checklist for that. Don't try to remember everything. If you can write it down and avoid trying to remember it, all the better.